Hello everyone, today we talk about the Ottomans and the fall of Constantinople, I'd add. Let's see how I will develop the video, I'm not sure yet. I recently made, well not so recently, maybe 1 month ago, one video about the Ottomans, the rise of the Ottomans. That is essentially the story of the Ismailian dynasty from the 13th to the 14th century. Today we will go a bit further, but we will try maybe to add what I skipped the other times. First of all, relatively to the emergence of the Ottoman state, relatively to the international situation in the Near and Middle East as well as in Europe, and perhaps concentrate on, we'll see, on a peculiar character of Ottoman civilization that is essentially first of all, the urban character of the Ottoman Empire. That is very important to mention. We didn't say it the other time, and more in general, something I hinted at also last time, relatively to the low cultural resistance that the Ottomans had in the integration of other cultures. In the sense that, this, as we'll see, derived essentially from the fact that, I mean, who were the Turks at this time? Were the guys that had arrived on horseback from Central Asia back in the middle? No, they weren't anymore. As a matter of fact, they had almost lost everything about that, and that is what allowed the Ottoman Empire to let's say to expand so easily and to become the superpower it essentially was. So between the 14th and 15th century, as we've seen in the other video, and as I think everybody knows, the Turkish Ottoman Empire took shape in this area between the Balkans and Anatolia. I would say first of all the Balkans, because it is true they came from Anatolia, but soon they began to basically to have the greater part of their dominions into Europe. This is also very meaningful aspect of Ottoman expansion that tells you a lot about what was really the core of their empire in many ways. And this power, as we know, was destined to rule over the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean and the one of the Black Sea, basically up to the First World War. So this is also pretty much unknown, but it's still something extremely fascinating. I mean, just thinking how long certain empires actually can last, historically speaking, and it is important in this sense to understand why it lasted so long as well. That goes also for the Roman Empire, it goes for the Achaemenid Empire, it goes also for the Chinese Empire, in spite of all the dynasties that and moment of discontinuity that definitely existed. But it's all the more meaningful when the rise of such empires is so sudden, and when it happens sometimes for very very weird coincidences, because this is what happens. I mean, usually, obviously, every power is originated usually from something smaller at the very beginning. Because even those empires that are essentially that are originated by the conquest of larger empires, and therefore just taking their own place, is one thing, but still will conquer them originated from somewhere. Think about the Macedons when they conquered the Persian Empire and giving birth to Alexander's empire that eventually got split up, but still into very large pieces that were, let's say, having sort of imperial dignity on its own. And thinking about the continuity of since we're talking about here the Islamic world, of the same caliphate, originally speaking, on the furrow of these older empires. Maybe across, maybe stretching from what were Roman to what were Persian lands, but indeed inhabiting regions that that had always seen the existence of great empires. As a matter of fact, previous to the Romans or the Parthians were the Seleucids, and then obviously Alexander and the old Achaemenids. So going back in time, you realize that there was a continuum here. In case of the Ottoman Empire, this continuity is chiefly with the Byzantine one. But the point what I wanted to make is that sometimes in history there are certain small entities that they're not even very well defined, because one thing is looking at Rome back in the day, that was at least a city. I mean, it was something pretty definite. In the Middle Ages, certain dynasties, and this happened also in Christian Europe, rose from relative nothingness very fast into very big powers. If you take the Ottonians, after all, I mean, they were a pretty, they originated from a comital dynasty like anyone else that existed in the empire. If you take the Habsburgs, they rose really as from in a very brief time from small counts, as they were called, to essentially the major power into the Holy Roman Empire, at least. then there were some reverses, but more or less they grew to be one of the most prominent powers into Europe eventually, to the modern contemporary eras. This is the case of the Ottomans too. I mean, they originated from a cauldron that, in this sense, was pretty chaotic, because it basically came out from the disintegration partly of the Sultanate of Iconium and of the Byzantine Empire, and there were lots of other competitors out there. So the birth of the Ottoman state is something very interesting in its birth, in the very origins, in my opinion, because it relatively, let's say, around the mid of the 13th century, the Sultanate of Rome, that is the state that had been formed in Anatolia by the Seljuk Turks between the 11th and 13th century, was destroyed by the Mongols and essentially obliged to pay very heavy tributes. You would say, but how was it destroyed and still paid tributes as such? Well, at that point, the point is that the Sultanate in itself had been a very strong power at that time, but it wasn't really, I use the word state, but it wasn't really a state in the modern sense of the word. It was still sort of, it was a dominant say central power from Iconium, definitely controlled very effectively large areas of Anatolia, but these areas were still populated by many other principalities, a bit like in feudal Europe practically. The Seljuk Turks, and this weren't excessively different in form, probably were closer to feudal Europe in their political organization than what the Arabs had been. There is a great difference between the Turks and the Arabs, in many ways. And so, first of all, the Sultanate of Rome had been originated from the defeat of the Byzantines at Manzikert in 1071. So that's what had opened Anatolia, the Anatolian plateau, to the Turks. And the Turks were calling the Sultanate they founded in there as the Sultanate of Rome, and Rome means nothing but Rome. I think in Turkish, I don't know whether in Arab too, because Arab was still also the language of every Islamic power. So the Turks at this point, the Seljuks, having obviously converted to Islam, and therefore using the term, because they and this is very important even in looking at the background of the rise of the Ottomans, because it tells you that these Turks that already existed before, obviously before the Ottomans in there, had seized the idea of being in continuity with the Roman rule in the region. This is very important. I actually discussed this now that I think about it in a video that is in the Medieval Islam playlist, which is called Seljuk Turks and Islamic World. In that I comment on the fact that the Seljuks basically weren't just all about the Arab Caliphate that they became to dominate and to safeguard, but they also looked at the Roman West, and they began to say, we want to be that too. And this is a mindset that, in perspective, is typical of, say, of primitive peoples like the Seljuks were where they came from the Central Steppes. Which is the idea that the more primitive your culture is and the less cultural resistance you have. And this is what is very important about the Ottomans as well, and why we will discuss them. The Ottomans even had a further plus compared to this, compared to the Seljuk Turks back in the day. So this Sultanate of Rome was still a bunch of people. It was like a cluster of principalities. If you look at, I don't know, there are other examples. If you take the ancient world, the Parthian kingdom. The Parthian kingdom was ruled by a unique dynasty. It was the Arsacid one. The Romans destroyed the Parthian kingdom twice. Once under Nero and another time under Marcus Aurelius. So the consequence of this is that basically the Arsacid defeat brought to the fragmentation of Parthian Persia, but it was still a cluster of those Parthian feudal lords that still made up the Parthian kingdom before those defeats. So there were still a unique bloc, and well, here the Turks in Anatolia were more or less like that. There were certain poles of power, that is, certain centers of power that extended their influence all over each other. By the way, there was a continuous competition, continuous struggle for power, but they still consider themselves as historically the descendants of those Seljuk Turks of the previous centuries, as a Turkish power in the area and still having a sort of cohesion. So the idea of paying tributes was also something pretty universal in history when you got defeated, but it was also a way of bargaining, in diplomacy relatively to the political and military dynamics. However, the tribute had sort of extra meaning for the Turks and the Mongols that had imposed it on them, because the tribute in the steppe is basically the ABC of political relations. Like, while in sedentary empires the tribute always exists in some form, but it's not formalized, in the steppe the tribute is something very heavy. It's really the idea that you depend from that power. And indeed the Mongols had conquered and swept all through the Middle East and the Near East, so they had, just for talking about the westernmost areas, then they had conquered basically the whole Asia, aside from Japan and I don't know, Vietnam or India, but they had this overwhelming power that all these Turkish principalities had to accept in a certain measures. Staying at the rule of the steppes, meaning that even when you study the Ottoman Empire, as we will see, the Ottomans were extremely multi-ethnical and multicultural. So you can't really define precisely them as Turks, as we will see, at least in the old term of the world, so those populations that came from the steppes. However, they still put, together all they could in terms of of political tools in practice, and the tribute was still recognized as this among for instance, the descendants of the Khans, of the Mongol Khans, and also populations like the Ottomans, as this originary relation that derived from the steppes. In fact, I think the Ottomans at a certain point had even a sort of reverential formal tribute paid to someone, like the Khanate of the Golden Horde, because even after a certain point the Ottomans rose to be more powerful than the Golden Horde Khanate. As formerly Turks, they recognized the old preeminence of the Mongols as steppes overlords. So they had from a certain point of view they still kept that reverence for this steppes from this past of the steppes from which they also came. By the way, also the Turks had the Khan title. As a normal thing. I mean, in many ways they were pretty homogeneous to the Mongols in many ways. I mean, the world of the steppe was in this sense pretty multi-ethnical, but the society was very homogeneous in many ways, and that's partly the reason why it was multi-ethnical, by the way, because there weren't many differences among these populations aside from maybe the ethnic origin meant as, I don't know, phenotypes or language, and in this sense they also used partly the same words like the Khanate. By the way, the Turks at this time, you might sometimes we characterize the Turks as this sort of Ugrian Mongol looking people. So but telling the truth, many of the Turks, since the beginning, were actually also of Indo-European origin, because it had been plenty of white populations like the Iranian ones of the Sarmatians and their descendants that had remained in the steppes, had mixed with the other population. So certain clans were definitely maybe very white, and there is nothing really to be surprised of. So really defining what is Turkish or not, even in here, it's more a name, it's more a form of political and social organization than anything else, really. And naturally, when the Seljuks were settling into the Anatolian plateau, they also had very intense relations with first of all, with local populations that they controlled, because even as it happens very often, these steppes peoples weren't that demographical numerous. The Turks didn't, I don't know how to say that, Turkicized the Anatolia. Anatolia remained what essentially was, ethnically speaking, and it couldn't be controlled but mixing with the local populations. But also interacted actively with the Byzantines. They weren't always enemies, especially during the Crusade era, but even afterwards. I mean, every Turkish prince basically could decide whether to side according to his personal individual conveniency, to side now with the Byzantines, now with the Crusaders, now with the Cilicians of Armenia, now with Mongols, and now with, it could really be very very mixed and very complicated in terms of political relationships. It is implied there were relationships also of other kinds. For instance, there were even certain marriages between the the Byzantines and the Turks. Yes, it did happen. Obviously, with traverse, relations. I mean, obviously, the most orthodox Byzantine imperial nobility of purpureous birth wouldn't marry with a Muslim, because we are Muslim Turk. We're pretty obvious. But there were certain sometimes certain necessities to make merry, this or that um, minor let's say family member with maybe a prominent Turkish prince or something like that, because um, that was a way to assure. I don't really remember now, but definitely there were certain, at least in the Sultanate of Rome, there was this idea, and it's been witnessed that around the Comnenian dynasty there had been a marriage with the Byzantines, and that's the reason why, by the way, the Ottomans claimed that descendancy. Mm. The So claiming that I mean that lineage, that an ancestry, descendancy doesn't exist in English. Excuse me, I drink a little. So I might even look a little while for this. I don't remember whether maybe I have this information. No, for now I don't, but I mean it did happen, so that the Ottomans believed that they were formerly descendants of the Roman emperors, and that's the reason why among the titles that they assumed when they conquered Constantinople was the one of Caesar. So there is nothing strange. It's pretty I'm saying all these things. There are even sort of challenging in many ways, because you say, well, these were Turks. I mean, we have built as Westerners an identity that is essentially in opposition with a positive with one of the of the Eastern world. It is, but this happened later. This happened when the Ottomans had actually that huge power that could allow the Western Europeans to begin thinking that they were Westerners. The term Westerners, in its narrowest meaning, that is essentially the one of Western Europeans, was born practically thanks, we can say, to the Ottoman Empire, because without that major, let's say, threat that brought our Western states to get together to try to halt it, well, we didn't have that strong European identity. It wasn't really felt. We still all felt more or less that we were this or that particular regional identity, and we knew that there was Europe, we knew that there was something in common. Actually, it was really more than else Christianity that banded us together, but not as Europeans, because there were Christians also elsewhere in the world that weren't Europeans. There were even Arab Christians, as today, by the way. So it was much more multi-ethnical. Europe before the rise of the Ottoman Empire was sort of still of an ecumenical Christian world. Europe was just a geographical expression in this sense. Well, after that the Ottomans tried to get through Europe, we developed also geographically this idea that if we belong to this part of Western Europe, we are Westerners, and sadly leaving out a part of the Easterners, because, by the way, if you think about the Poles, that I personally consider, obviously, even the Russians to be as Westerners. I mean, to me, Westerners is really meant, not in the broader sense, because in the broader sense, there are even the Japanese that are considered Westerners, and those aren't, obviously, at least for my standards. I mean, there are certain standards for which, I don't know, the Japanese are considered Westerners and the Brazilians not, which is just pretty weird. But my concept of Westerner is essentially the idea of essentially speaking an Indo-European language, being white, essentially, but obviously not in a racist term, but having this kind of evident Indo-European origin, even from an ethical point of view, I would say also Christian, but more than else, I would say Christian influence, because they realize that even if you're an atheist, you can still be a Westerner. I don't see, I know that obviously there are lots of religious people who say, yeah, first of all, we are Westerner because we are Christians. Really not, because there are many Christians also elsewhere, as we were saying. So if you want to be considered as Westerner for being a Christian, you should give up, however, the idea that you are also European and you have a certain appearance, because there are Christians all over the world, and also historically in areas like the Near East, where Christianity actually was there before than it was in Europe, and it still is. So it's a bit complicated, but at the origins, I mean, when the Ottomans were rising, they were rising in a world that was still culturally and identitarily very fluid, chiefly for themselves. Because it's not easy to be born as as an independent, or at least autonomous political entity in 13th, 14th century Anatolia, because that was a moment into which nobody actually knew who was who, because the Byzantine Empire had been destroyed. I mean, it was still there, but it wasn't anymore what it had been before 1204 and the Crusaders' sack of Constantinople. So it was very complicated. There had been a lot of cultural intersections. There had been lots of Westerners, of Crusaders settling as feudal lords in Anatolia. Then the Turks were in crisis, because evidently if they had this kind of ethnic pride from being this warlike horse-riding people that had come as a winner, as a conqueror from the steppes. First of all, they had been destroyed by the Mongols, and secondly, they had at this point already mixed with the local Anatolian population that was all but Turkish. The Crusaders also in there had lost practically the majority of the Holy Land, actually the whole Holy Land, and still retained certain. So they were in this existential crisis, for which were still the remnants. Thinking about the Lusignan dynasty, were still out there. The Mamluks were in crisis. The Mamluks were the major power that existed in the Near East, ruling from Egypt actually, but having this sphere of influence in there. So it was a moment of great, actually of great crisis. And it's not surprising that the Ottomans rose from that point. So especially what more directly invested the Ottomans was really the decline of Seljuk power and the Persian influence. In my last video, I didn't talk about the Persian influence. I gave a gaze to this. International factors that triggered the rise of the Ottomans, because that was the video was chiefly about, and I discussed chiefly the decline of the Mamluks by saying essentially that the Mamluks, for certain socio-economical reasons that we can't repeat now, just go look that video if you're interested, as an advice. Were in decline. So even if they were a major power, they had, and still very influential, they were growing weaker, so they were essentially loosening the grip over Anatolia. It's not that they ever managed to conquer Anatolia, but they were still really the bigger power that was out there. So the Mamluks were Sunni, knowingly, because the Turks had been, the Fatimid Egypt had been Shia, historically speaking. Then when the Turks, the Kurds, arrived, formed the Ayyubid dynasty, and then the Mamluks, etc., they brought Sunnism, because the Turks initially had, even though very heavily Persianized, they had basically risen to power by assuming the defense of the Baghdad Caliphate, so the old Abbasid Caliphate, which was renownedly Sunni. So the Turks were traditionally Sunni in this sense, and also the Ottomans were Sunni. But there was this other major opponent that was actually less powerful than Mamluks. That was the Khanate of Iran. Persia, whatever you want to call it, had been, as all those the Middle East regions, being conquered by the Mongols. So the Mongols had to create the White Khanate, the Hill Khanate in there. Persia is this, we discussed about Persian history recently, and Persia is this region in the Middle East that wherever it happens in history, it always remains Persia, because it is this pretty, I'd say, hostile plateau that, environmentally speaking, that is very difficult to control, that has a very deeply rooted feudal nobility, that has a castle every, I don't know where, I don't know how much, that is basically that if you want to conquer it you should conquer castle by castle, and nobody managed that. To do that, Mongols did that with the sheer force of their armies, but they had to, when eventually the Mongol Empire split up in parts, they had basically to adapt to the local politics and to essentially become Persian in their own turn, so that Persia kept surviving as a Persian thing, even if influenced by the Mongols. But what I mean is that, as it had happened for the Arabs at the beginning, I mean, they made this huge conquest. Then it realized, I mean, it's not that they realized it, it was simply that they couldn't hold it as a central government, as a unitary domain, and it immediately split up in entities that weren't split up in that fashion by the Arabs, but simply corresponded to the to certain cultures, to certain local powers that pre-existed the Arab invasions, and that had a sort of regional scale of unity. Think about Caliphate of Cordoba, the Aghlabids in Tunisia, then think about the Fatimids in Egypt. I mean, these powers basically were these new powers were essentially just retracing what had been the pre-existent local power, and this is what it had happened with Persia. Now, Persia was traditionally Shia, as we know. And just like today, the Persians, because this is in a nutshell the history of the Middle East, that the Persian hated the Arabs' guts, and vice versa, but probably the Persians more, because the Persians have always felt superior, culturally speaking, to the Arabs, and I don't like to say that there are cultures that are more or less superior than others, but indeed Persia has been a you know you know a pole of civilization that emanated civilization in the sense, radiating culture all around that is since the times of the Achaemenid Empire. So it obviously the Persians were and are very proud about their own identity. And at this time, the Khanate of Iran was definitely opposite to the Mamluks. Albeit Turkish, they were essentially ruling over Arab lands. They were Sunni, and they had these ambitions into the definitely into the Near East that they almost all controlled, and obviously having certain not let's say never abandon hopes to extend over the rest of the Middle East in some form. The Persians were in parts the heirs of the Mongols in this sense, as we have seen, because the Ilkhanate was a direct descendant of the ancient Mongol Empire. As you know, it had split up into Iran partly. And historically the Mongols had been defeated by the Mamluks, so there was this inherent, burning memory of the fact that the Mamluks had managed to stop the Mongol advance towards Egypt substantially, because otherwise the Mongols would have easily conquered that. I mean, historically speaking, all the great conqueror from the east, from that region, from the direction of Persia, the great empires that were there, had always looked at the west, at let's say expanding their own power on the world Near East, and therefore controlling Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and the Caucasus, so to basically absorb all the traffics that came from the Silk Road toward the west. Egypt, these were easy land to conquer, let's say, to maintain, historically speaking. I mean, these were lands that had the resources to host a big power. So there are regions that are historically fragmented because of environmental reasons, mostly mountainous areas, usually so more easily the rise of principalities, of feudalism in some form. The rich, wealthy, populated flat land is usually instead the cradle of large empires that, in this sense, as we were saying before, can, form and die, but simply, switching ruler practically in the same region. So, in this sense, the newcomers inherit the previous forms of government and can rule with a very solid authority on those lands. Well, the Mamluks had halted the Mongols, and the Persians, in this sense, were riding the wave of the together with their own let's say personal issues with the Arabs, let's say the idea that Iran had to be necessarily a major regional power in the area, and that clashing against the Mamluks was the Mamluks were the first competitors, the first enemy to knock out. The problem is that Persia was, first of all, it had problems on its own because Persia is a huge land and as a consequence has also lots of frontiers that were all but cold in the political and military, especially military sense of the word. Certain frontiers of Iran are also cold climatically speaking, but this is another matter. So it's not the Persian, this time was this excruciatingly powerful entity, aside from certain parentheses that we will see would happen with Timur in the 15th century. So it was a big power, but it couldn't at that point really overextend like the Mongols had done. So such a thing implied the clash against other major powers, such as the Mamluks, that could result into a deadly affair. So what, however, the Persians could do was to, first of all, had been to expand its influence into Anatolia. Because Anatolia was seen probably in this fashion the battleground, the only battleground, or at least I don't want to oversimplify, to say mistaken things on purpose, but I'm saying is that there are, today's examples are pretty important because we see today that there are certain major powers in the world that fight each other not on their borders but on faraway lands. This is something we're pretty used to, historically speaking. And this is what essentially the Persians and the Mamluks were doing. It's interesting, by the way, that certain regions of the world are always the same, including the one of the Near East in this case. So Persia was basically playing onto Anatolia to stem the Mamluk expansionism. There were several reasons for this. First of all, obviously the Anatolian powers didn't look particularly favorably upon, first of all, known business and known power to interfere in their own business. Anatolia is a sort of region on its own that is, let's say, quite clearly defined from a geographical point of view. So they didn't like the Persians, and they didn't like the Egyptians. However, the Mamluks were closer in a certain sense. The Persian threat was there, because we will see the Persians will invade at a point, same Anatolia. But there were, let's say, stronger ties probably with Persia than probably the same Anatolians didn't want to admit, because Anatolia is this kind of mountainous land that extending eventually through the Caucasus enters directly. I mean, it has a continuous homogeneity, geographically speaking, with the Persian plateau. And those regions, Anatolia, Caucasus, and Iran, had been historically, you can't say more strongly related, but let's say that in opposition with Syria and Mesopotamia. So these flatlands, these semi-arid flatlands that existed south of this, instead rather cold areas, were something different. So actually, Persian culture, historically speaking, had always been there. The Caucasus was very heavily Persianized in culture. As we've seen, the Seljuk Turks were also had been Persianized, culturally speaking, even though they had chosen more to support more than else the let's say the Caliphate side, the Abbasid side. Therefore, and Persia could therefore relatively easily play on this area. As we have seen, it had managed to essentially subjugate formerly the Anatolian principates. Potentates, let's say better, because principate is kind of too narrow as a meaning. There were many different type of powers into Anatolia, and the idea was that that even though the Turks didn't like the Persian presence, at least it granted some form of stability, and especially once because it was a decentralized government, right? And especially the westernmost area of Anatolia, so enjoyed, let's say, a certain degree of autonomy in this sense. So among the various emirates that existed into Anatolia, there was one emerging from the region of Bithynia, that is essentially this area, this region that is the one that eventually meets with Thrace in the string on the Bosphorus, and therefore has access both to the Marmara Sea and the Black Sea. The Saudi emergence of an emirate that had been essentially the home to in previous times to a tribe of nomad Turks coming from Turkestan that had had moved west essentially to flee from the Mongol invasions. This had also happened. I mean, the Seljuk Turks arrived in very ancient times, so we're talking about essentially the 9th, 10th century, and then continued obviously to flow in part. But the Mongol invasion had pushed, like it had happened a bit with the Huns back in the late antique times, to a new injection, let's say, of Turkish elements into the west, because all these guys that were dwelling in the steppes. So the Mongol advance, they decided in part not to accept Mongol rule, and they transferred themselves into these Turkish lands. That these lands where other Turks previously had settled into the Near East, and also in Anatolia. So it goes without saying that we're talking about the Ottomans at this point. They weren't called like that. They had their leader was Ottoman, where they took the name from. And they began essentially in the first half of the 14th century to move from the original settlement of Dorelium, extending their control over all the Anatolic region facing the Marmara Sea. The Dorelium, historically speaking, had been it's a name that recurs in the Crusades, because there were at least that I can remember two major defeats of the Crusades in there by the hand of the Seljuk Turks. One in the first actually the Battle of Dorelium, initially speaking, was a Crusader victory, but it was still a pretty bloody engagement. Eventually the Turks had to retreat. In the Second Crusade instead, the Turks had managed to slaughter to at least to defeat and to divert their path the Crusader army. That was a very unfortunate expedition, by the way. But however, so it was a name that kind of bore this. Dorelium was the first major Turkish avampost in the Crusader era, coming from the west. So it was a kind of frontier area loaded with some historical meaning in this sense, and the Byzantines had always also tried to retake those areas. A certain time, I think, even succeeding before the further defeats that occurred. But whatever, this is not important. And probably I'm also messing up a little. But the important thing is that the Ottomans rose to conquest Bursa in 1326, Nicaea, I don't know how you say that in English, in 1331, and Nicomedia in 1337. And they made of the first of Bursa the first capital of their dominions. So this political ascent, this political ascent was definitely favored partly by a moment into which the Iranian Khanate was declining, the extinction of the Seljuk dynasty, and also partly the Mamluk crisis. So here you understand the westernmost area of Asia, practically the one that has just Europe facing from the other side of the sea, was very favored by the complexive decline of other major Near Eastern power. So the characteristics of this new dominion, and this is what I think it's very important at this point to remember, came, presented itself as one of a state based on cities. So who were these guys? Were these the old Turks of the, the let's say the Turks of the old days that had come there as nomads and settling in the Anatolian plateau on the countryside, seeking for pastures and all? They weren't. At this point, the population of the Ottoman Empire, let's say of the so-called Turkish population, that was, as we've said, in reality the result of centuries of basically of ethnical mix that at this point had very few left of the old Turkish um, nomad lifestyle and identity. Was a largely sedentary one. Mm. And the urban communities had become very soon the centers of power. There were crafts and trades, and those were areas that, by the way, had also a bit of a different history compared to the rest of the Near East, because they had been for a longer time under the Roman Empire. Anatolia, especially the western part of it, had been one of the most intensely Romanized and urbanized areas of the world. Also thanks to the Greek presence, because some of the major Greek cities back in the day had developed also on the Asian coast of the Aegean Sea. So it was a very florid area into which the Ottoman Empire was originated, and this is very meaningful because it wasn't originated into the center of Anatolia, where there are very few centers. It was largely a pastoral area, so a very rural world with we can't say far away from civilization, but however not extremely developed in terms of urban centers of trade and all, like the coastal cities. So the Ottomans basically originated from a world that was much more Westerner than it had been probably any other the case for any other Turkish domination at that point. Mm. The Turks had ruled on very large areas, and even if some of them were actually also equally intensely urbanized, they were still they had another matrix. They had another mold. There were cities of huge first of all very ancient very ancient past and of great demographical size. Think about Baghdad, think about Merv, think about all the other centers that I mean there were obviously also other Near Eastern centers that had a Roman influence. Take Damascus, take Jerusalem, or and this I mean there had been other areas of the Muslim world that were westernized in some fashion, but definitely the westernmost, even culturally speaking, was Western Anatolia. Mm. So those were the areas where the Byzantines had ruled more intensely. Let's say that aside from Constantinople, the Byzantine rule had been centered, especially before Manzikert, much more on Asia than Europe. The Nicaea was a very important center. The rest, let's say Greece, Thessaly, and even Thrace, were relatively, I can't say peripheral in the Byzantine world, but still had developed in a bit of a different thing. The real core of the medieval Roman Empire was really the area into which eventually the Ottomans came to dominate, let's say as a core dominion. So this meant that the Ottomans were open since the beginning to certain cultural influences that were very, very important and that molded their own identity in a fashion that was extremely, first of all, integrative, open-minded, that stretched across several different cultures, from which the Ottomans could take all the very best from. Mm. In this sense, the Ottomans were the true heirs of the Romans from a cultural point of view, not from a formal point of view, because obviously the Byzantines were the only one who could claim that. But let's say while the Byzantine mindset had passed, let's say, from this extremely fluid, extremely open-minded one to something more elitist, something more closed, something more traditionalist, the Ottomans stayed open. This is what happened, by the way, also uh, with other populations, historically speaking, that were, let's say, very they were able, paradoxically, to learn and to learn from their enemies and to surpass them in ability in a certain measure. With the Ottomans and the Byzantines, obviously was a sort of unfair play, because the Byzantines were relatively declining, especially from a certain point onwards. They were really passive to what was happening around them, and the Ottomans had say the strength of a young power. But at the same time, it's not, we shouldn't stress biological metaphors too much. I mean, these were still powers that could take different paths, and it's still very meaningful that the Ottomans took the path they did, and managed to expand so much, including conquering finally the Constantinople. And that has to do, in my opinion, largely with the Ottoman mindset that was unknown to most Muslim powers, that although more open-minded than we can imagine, were sometimes a bit more traditionalist, a bit more close, a bit more tied to say, the local traditions, the local sort of a unitary dimension, just like Iran or Egypt. I mean, those were in that sense a sort of a mononational, but I know it's wrong, it's an approximation, but it's just to give you the idea. The Ottomans were really, what were the Ottomans? Can't say they were Turks, yeah, but we've seen they practically weren't, that they were practically Anatolians. The Turks had blended into the local population since a long time. This is another very important part. Many Turks actually, what at that time and just still today, are white. Evidently, I mean, there are certain Europeans that sometimes are darker than the fairer Turks. So the Turkish name in this sense has nothing strictly ethnical in the it's just a name. It just brings the glory of the old conquerors, but the local people who built up the Ottoman Empire were something very very different in practice. They were partly the heirs of the Greeks, of the Romans, of the Byzantines, and or whoever had inhabited those lands that were since very ancient times largely mixed. There had been lots of Indo-Europeans there since the Hittites and all. So really look at the mosaic that the Ottoman Empire was, and the synthesis that the Ottomans were able to make to eventually rise to the power they managed to create. So as we were saying, another major, especially when the Ottomans crossed the straits of the Dardanelles, they greatly enjoyed the weakness of the Byzantine Empire. So getting to Europe from this core Anatolian lands, they swept actually quite easily into regions, especially as like Thrace. So they basically managed to take away most of the Balkanic lands that Constantinople was controlling. So that as a paradox, they managed to actually expand much deeper into Europe than in Anatolia itself. This is also a very important character of the Ottoman Empire. That geographically speaking, at the beginning was, at least at this point, at the beginning of the 15th century, was mostly a European than an Asian power. There was a major obstacle, by the way, to the Ottoman expansion at one point when Timur the Lame, Timur the Great, better, that was this heir of essentially the Mongols, is one of the greatest commanders and rulers in the history of mankind, that managed to create an empire that from, say, had its core especially into Persia, and managed to extend it partly to towards India, and then stretching to the Near East and Caucasus, and actually invaded Anatolia. So there were actually a lot of clashes. The Ottomans were also defeated at one point. However, for the same reason I was telling before, even for a Persian power to stretch up to Anatolia was a pretty amazing feat. So it didn't have the resources to keep these territories for long. At the death of Timur, first of all, Timur had defeated, in fact, this happened at the beginning of the 15th century. In 1402, there was the major Ottoman defeat, the Battle of Ankara. So in the very heart of the Anatolian plateau, where the Ottomans had managed to expand. By the way, we're skipping a bit the strictly geographical expansion of the empire, because maybe I will do it more thoroughly in another video, but I'm more concerned about these concepts. So and the Timur's invasion actually halted the Ottoman expansion for quite a long time, because defeats like those cannot be recovered also in terms of resources pretty easily. We're still in the 15th century. I mean, it's still a relatively poor world. The crop rate is what it is. You have to let these powers regain strength after such stress, and this was incidentally very important, because the Persian invasion of Turkey actually let's say delayed the fall of Constantinople itself. The Ottomans would have conquered Constantinople much earlier if it had not been for Timur the Great. And this obviously shaped even European history in a completely different way, because the Ottomans might have, I don't know, I frankly don't know, honestly, whether this would have actually favored the Ottomans themselves, because not always the quickest expansion is the most solid one. So if Constantinople had fallen, say, at the beginning of the 15th century, you know, maybe it would have been worse in immediate terms for the Europeans, but maybe the Ottomans would have swept too fast into the Balkans, and it would have crumbled earlier. I mean, the whole history would have been different, really. But in perspective, at least, we generally this delay is recorded in terms as we were like lucky as Europeans not to to have had Tamerlan invaded, let's say, stemmed the Turks from the east, because otherwise they would have swept much earlier into Europe, and we might have not stopped them. These are kind of I'm actually very I will make a video surely about these topics, because even the Ottoman advance has to be understood proper, especially during the 16th century. There are certain concepts that I think in Europe are overly, let's say, bold. I mean, we objectively built, as I was saying, our identity on the fact that we halted the Ottomans. In a actually many peoples think about it was really about the Poles, the Austrians, the Venetians. I mean, there was a really big joint fort. The only ones who were rowing against were like the French and the Protestants, maybe in some occasion, but whatever. This dramatic Ottoman advance had all, from the European side, we look at that as if they were this huge unstoppable monster. If you look at it from a Turkish perspective, instead, you realize that the Ottoman Empire had actually lots of difficulties to achieve these conquests. I mean, it was immensely powerful, no doubt, but there is also a reason if eventually the Europeans won and eventually the Ottoman Empire crumbled, because let's be fair about this, even at the peak of the Ottoman power, the Ottoman Empire had basically 4 open fronts. The ones with the Poles, the one with the Austrians, the one with the Venetians, and the one with the Persians. And believe me, the Ottoman Empire simply, it's not that it lost because, the Europeans had better technology and all these things that are often said mistakenly at all. The Ottomans were extremely advanced in that. It's simply that it's a sheer massive amount of resources that you have to invest, and the Ottoman Empire, in spite so large, simply didn't have them. I mean, at the siege of Crete, the Venetians bled the Ottoman Empire white. Let's be honest about it. And we have to erase the myth that Goliath is stronger than David. And even the biblical, comparison is pretty meaningful under this point of view. I mean, big empires have also lots of additional attrition to build up. And the Ottoman Empire had an amazing expansion, but at this point it was also difficult to maintain it, and especially when we're not talking about passive elements. I mean, it's not a sheer mathematical force. There are also moral forces implied. I mean, if there is such a huge power that expands so enormously, then who is rallying all around is kind of freaks out and puts a huge effort to avoid annihilation, to try to stem it. And this is what the most, let's say some Europeans did when they saw that the Ottomans were at their door. But in this sense, it's a very strong iron arm competition, let's say. And it's not necessarily the big guy is the one that has to win, and in fact this was the case. So as we all know, the major goal of the Ottomans was definitely the 1453 conquest of Constantinople. This was the let's say the accomplishment of a very I would say very logical and very very natural expansionistic project that was carried out by Mehmet, I don't know you say that, the second, who ruled from 1451 to 1481. So Constantinople had to fall from a Turkish perspective because it was evidently first of all, the major city out there. It doesn't matter it had declined, it doesn't matter the Crusaders had spoiled it of basically of all the treasures and all. Constantinople fell. It fell for many reasons. Generally, from a strategical one, it was evident from a certain point onwards that the Ottomans weren't being stopped. I mean, actually, even up to the very last year, Constantinople could have been saved. Not to make it fall in 1453, but there has been a moment onwards from which Constantinople it was just a matter of time before it fell. Basically, the Turks had been preparing for this like forever. The Constantinople was the golden apple, and the Turks had, by the way, taken out one by one all the major Byzantine centers. They had got extremely skilled in siege warfare. They were literally passionate about artillery. The Ottomans were the power that made major advancements in artillery during the period. And this is also very meaningful relatively to their open-mindedness compared to the other Muslim powers, because and that tells you how more Western-minded they actually were. Actually, even more relatively to firearms, the Ottomans were much more eager than the European. I mean, in the Europeans had certain cultural resistance with about chivalry to the adoption of firearms. But talking about the Muslim world, especially the Mongol-derived, the heirs of the Mongol Empire, looked very unfavorably from a cultural point of view to firearms. The Tartars especially loathed it. They kind of mocked those who used it. I must say the Mamluks, the Mughals, and also the Persians, but probably this larger multi-ethnical empires like the Mughals and partly the Mamluks were also quite advanced for artillery. Actually, the Venetians and the Mamluks had been the ones back in the 14th century who had pioneered artillery technology. The Ottomans arrived actually to the top at this point, and were masters in logistics. They were structuring brilliantly their armored forces. First of all, passing from the old, say, slave militia to tribal militia to professional permanent army. That is the Janissary, so the Janissaries. So there were, and this is amazing because it tells you that they were adopting the same Byzantine model of state, something that was not present elsewhere around there. So this gives you the dimension of how really westernized they were. And the capture of Constantinople was this amazing. The Westerners. It was at that time when they realized their mistake. I made a video that is the fall of Constantinople, the Westerners and the fall of Constantinople, if you want to go look at that. Actually, in that video I discuss how the Westerners were a bit more caring than what is usually told relatively to the fall of Constantinople, even before. But there were many complicated factors that eventually led the city to fall in the way it did, with a very few relatively few Westerner, actually mostly volunteers. There were mostly Italians and from Venice and Genoa, but even the Venetian and Genoese governments hadn't basically endorsed this thing more than much. I mean, there were well, it's complicated. In that video I explain it. Now I don't have the time, so if you want to go take a look at that, you're welcome. But the important thing about the fall of Constantinople is often overlooked, is that the local Byzantines basically at one point preferred, even as they said, the turban to the tiara, which means that basically the Westerners had, especially the Pope, pushed for, this was kind of the blackmail. We help you against the Turks if you convert to Catholicism, which was an insult, but the Byzantines at one point were kind of they kind of accepted it in order to do this, and it was done mostly by the elites, by the imperial court and all. While the rest of the let's say the majority of the, we can say, Greek at this point population was actually very very outraged by this. And as a matter of fact, the reunion of the two churches had happened before. During, say, previously to the fall of Constantinople, and seemingly the reason is that there were many Greeks who actively helped the Ottomans to conquer the city because they preferred the Ottomans to the Pope, essentially. And this is something that it doesn't have to be read in an eminently religious key, because there are also other factors, such as the fact that probably the Greek middle class that developed actually into the Byzantine Empire compared to the Western world, but it was still there, probably saw the advantages that could derive from from the Turkish domination, especially because Constantinople, as it did, would have become a great capital once again. I mean, the Turks transformed Constantinople, gave it once again this imperial dignity that substantially de facto had been degraded by the 1204 Crusader sack, for which Constantinople was still Constantinople, but it wasn't as great as it had been. Well, the Ottomans made of Constantinople a great city, a great capital once again. And therefore we will see how many actual Greeks converted to Islam to enter into the Ottoman bureaucracy, to make career. And there were also, by the way, lots of Orthodox that kept leaving. I mean, there is still in Istanbul today the Orthodox community. I mean, there is the idea that the Ottoman Empire kept, especially, I don't know, the Ottoman Empire, for instance, was much more tolerant toward the Jews than the Westerners were. There were a lot of very wealthy Jewish people who came away from extremely wealthy and developed regions like the Netherlands during the 16th century back to not back, but to Constantinople, bringing all their money with them. There was especially a very rich Jewish heiress, and whose name I don't remember, that was extremely wealthy, and there were rumors that she was about to move to Constantinople, and Charles V of Habsburg was kind of, with his intelligence, was keeping track of her movements, because he didn't want her to move away with all that money to the Ottoman Empire, and instead she managed to. There were also a lot of Venetians that visiting Constantinople regularly between, let's say, a war and another, because they kept trading with the Turks, actually so that they were better off as maybe as Jews in the Ottoman Empire than Christians in Venice, as not because Christians in Venice were persecuted, those were Christian powers as well, but there were lots of kind of advantages practically to that. And part of the reason is that, by the way, the Ottoman Empire wasn't so extremely economical dynamic like the West. So this was actually an Ottoman policy to attract merchants, to attract people who were traditionally involved into banking, like the Jews and other. So just to revive say to increase Ottoman let's say economical competition capabilities in the Mediterranean. Yet the Ottoman Empire, for many reasons, remained actually less competitive than the Western world. But this was also how the whole thing was made, and its kind of culture in the meanwhile, because there were lots of exchanges, there were actually lots of Westerners who went leaving into the Ottoman Empire. They converted to Islam. They brought with them. They were usually military advisors or other people who were involved with the major technological advancements of the West that were in this sense looked upon favorably by the Ottomans, who, as we have seen, were pretty open to this thing. To this integration of knowledge of techniques and all. So the Constantinople was famously renamed as Istanbul. That seemingly, because I think this is not sure, I think it came from the local Greek tongue that basically when the Ottoman guards asked the local population where they were going, like in patrols and police operations, they said something like, this is surely wrong in Greek, so please Greek audience don't get offended. It's something like Eis attain Polin. So it was translated in Istanbul. So I go, which means I go to the city, because the city, the polis that was Constantinople pro excellence, because Constantinople had been objectively the city pro excellence, just like Rome. So it was not going to Constantinople; it was going to the city proper. Constantinople became the capital of the Ottoman Empire. It entered, as we were saying, a new phase of political, economical, and cultural splendor. And we will talk about Ottoman administration more in depth one day. The Ottoman court was one of the most the Sublime Gate, it was this court that was the Topkapi, where the original imperial the Byzantine palace existed. The Ottomans built upon it. There were 3 levels, 3 gates. The most internal one was the so-called Sublime Gate, where the Ottoman and the Sultan lived proper. The others were used either for meeting the diplomats. The central part and the external part was for the serfs or for other people who lived in there. Now I don't remember precisely, but the greatness of this is that, as we were saying, the Ottoman Empire gave itself the structure of a state with an administrative apparatus, bureaucracy, central government, so advanced fiscal system through which they paid the army, professional standing army. So it's something very magnificent that in part, as we were saying, inherited the statal Byzantine tradition and was some of the most advanced forms of political or administrative systems that existed at the time in Europe. So the Sultan had an absolute power in practice. In theory. Then in practice, obviously, we're still talking about the late Middle Ages, early modern era. There were ways into which, but especially in the beginning, the greatest struggles were really within let's say the imperial family proper. There weren't initially many revolts, but the problem is that the imperial family was, in this sense, there wasn't really a formalized successory system. They tried to do that, but at every time it was literally a run. Every time the news of the Sultan's death arrived, it was literally a run to seize the throne from the various imperial families members running from wherever they were from the surrounding provinces to seize the throne. There were very bloody fights because of that, and this gave the empire some political instability. Then eventually this was partially increased over time, but initially, for the rest, the world system was otherwise very well organized. Both the estates and the political administrative system were founded on the so-called Timar institution. The Timar was essentially a territorial districtuation of the empire that had also military meaning. Was also in here it partly inherited the Byzantine system as it had been formed from the Pronoia, with the Pronoia. Essentially, the Timar was a region that the Ottoman Empire was made up of Timars. So these repartitions that could be very different among each other, even in terms of local government, because the Ottoman Empire was huge. At the beginning of the 16th century, it's basically stretched from Sudan to the Ukraine, and from Hungary to the Persian Gulf. So it was an enormous thing. And every Timar was a sort of state on its own. I mean, not really a state, but sort of a local, as a province that with certain characteristics. And as I said, that's where the local armies were raised, because the Timariot, so the guy who was entrusted to the government of the Timar, had to raise a certain amount of forces, military forces, that in this sense were very diverse. The Ottoman, aside from the Janissaries that were the standing army with I can say a uniform, but I mean at least the idea of a certain homogeneity, they were a permanent professional body. The largest number of the Ottoman army were made up by the Mariot Contingents, and these were very different because the Timar of Thrace was obviously extremely different from the one of Syria, and the local troops were recruited in this sense in their with their local military traditions. So every Timar of the empire provided very different kind of troops. Plus, obviously, you have to think that the Ottoman Empire called troops also from allies and from the surroundings. There was an extremely diverse nature of the Ottoman army, and this also actually brought to some problem, because there were all different peoples brought together to fight, and they were usually light troops. There was rarely a huge amount of heavy, the Ottomans, compared to the Westerners, they had everything from a tactical point of view. The only thing they consistently lacked was, aside from the Janissaries, they were mostly light, telling the truth as well, but it was a solid body of line infantry, of pikemen and of musketeers, and practically, arquebusiers and musketeers. So they had usually lighter troops, light cavalry, light infantry, very good at skirmishing, very good especially into the Balkanic lands that are have a pretty rough terrain, but that in open field, began to suffer consistently when the Europeans began to produce their pike and shot tactics, especially during the 17th century, and they began essentially to feel for that. But as we have said, it wasn't really much about technological difference between East and West, which there wasn't. This is a myth I've tried to dispel even in videos like the one of the Great Turkish Bombard, for instance. It was really about the society. I mean, just like the Byzantine Empire had basically lacked the dynamism of the Western middle classes, well, the Ottomans did too. That's why they were calling for let's say businessmen in there, because that's what they genuinely lacked. It was a society with some guys, very wealthy guys at the top, and lots of poor people down, which was pretty much what the world was about at that time, including the West. But simply West in proportion had way more commoners, let's say, wealthy commoners, in say relatively wealthy commoners that could make the bulk up of, I don't know, of town militias, of infantry that could serve well and could form this alliance of pikers, of pikemen and musketeers, which the Ottomans never quite developed in that form, in that European form. But anyhow, the Mariot system was actually pretty advanced at the time. It did work. It was also pretty simple, and it differently from the feudal system in Europe, the Timar wasn't given as a fief. I mean, at least it wasn't trusted up to, I mean, for a certain time, or even up to the death of the Timariot. But then it came back into imperial hands. This was very important because although obviously the Timars leaders could develop certain local power on their own, of course, still the system was such that Istanbul kept a substantial control on these provinces at the point of being able to substitute the governors and all. So this really gave an edge to the Ottoman Empire in a certain sense, and Ottoman politics and military were much more unitary than the one of the West. It was still essentially a feudal world, in spite of the rise of the state, let's say. And there are beautiful passages written by Machiavelli on this. You know, the difference between France, and it was seen at the time the most advanced state in Europe, and the Ottoman Empire. Machiavelli says very clever things about that, including the fact that that France, for instance, was theoretically easy to invade but difficult to control. Because you could split up the nobility against the king and all, but the nobility was very deeply rooted into the local lands, so they kind of resisted till the end. It's also very theoretical because Machiavelli is not this this huge realism and objectivity we think, but he looked in this sense also, even if in a approximate way, well, the Ottoman Empire by saying, you know, it's very difficult to defeat it because the Ottoman Sultan has always a standing army, can raise that army, move it wherever he wants, so he can counter every invasion without having to ask, like you said, the French for their nobles to participate and all. But once you defeat that army, it's easy to seize because basically the whole system revolves around the capital. If you take Constantinople, it's done. Unfortunately, the Europeans never made it. Maybe after Lepanto they might have achieved that, but also in here it's a very complicated story. But just for saying that this really, that even in the West, it was very clearly perceived that the Ottoman Empire was something more unitary than anything that existed in Europe at the time. So I would like also to concentrate a little bit on how on what was really the impact of the Ottoman culture and ethnicity on Europe. As we have said, it's not really a genetic thing, because there were definitely certain resettlements of populations from certain areas of Asia into Europe at this time. This was done by the Ottomans to control better, especially certain areas of the Balkans that were very difficult, and hence the Muslim presence still in there today, historically. This was done pretty much everywhere, really. It was a very old thing to do, and a pretty effective one, because the idea is you settle someone in a land, and therefore you basically transform it in their own, so that even if there is still someone else in there, you kind of make those people behave as if that was their land as well, and could support the Turkish government in this sense to have it protected. As you can understand, the cultural and ethnic impact of the Ottomans in the empire was very heterogeneous, depending on the region, on the environment, and the different situations, by the way, through which the conquerors came into contact with those lands. The Seljuk conquest had managed to transform Anatolia essentially in a Turkish and Muslim country. In the Balkanic area, there was evenly instead the Christian presence. Christians of either Greek, Slavic, or Albanian ethnicity. So the Turkization of the conquered lands entailed as we have seen, the transfer of certain of Turkish people within peoples of different ethnicity, and it was very this happened very early and very intensely in Bithynia, that, as we said, was largely a Byzantine area, even culturally, etc. It was easy to do it afterwards a bit all over the Greek Anatolia in practice. It also invested consistently the southeastern region of the Balkans, so Thrace, Macedon, and Bulgaria, and especially southern Bulgaria, I'd say, were pretty intensely transformed in this sense. While it was mainly a coastal presence. The interland were sometimes very difficult access. There were lands, like if you think about Montenegro, for instance, or certain parts or Serbia, those were regions that remained for centuries historically under the Ottoman domination, and practically had an extremely superficial, at least, or even non-existent degree of Ottomanization, let's say. I don't know who can use this term. It sounds terrible, because simply the local communities within the mountains were simply isolated from there. They always existed. It was too, costly to go in there and take them out, also because they didn't have this huge power. They were, however, mostly for militarized regions, for which the Ottoman presence translated itself chiefly in military garrisons and not on populating, because the local populations were completely they couldn't be changed. I mean, they preferred to die rather than having Muslims in there. And therefore the Balkans, the Balkan mainland is pretty it's pretty nasty territory, telling the truth. It's very difficult to access it. The geography, the orography is terrible. The environment is pretty tough. I mean, all the Ottomans cared about, as really like the Byzantines had done from a certain point of view, was really to occupy the coasts, the coastal centers, so that maybe trade and goods came from the mainland, but unavoidably passing from these urban centers. So all the Ottomans cared about was to take money from, from tolls and taxes and all, from that trade, and they were content just of that. Um, areas as Bosnia, Serbia, Albania, Epirus, Thessaly, the Peloponnese were um, the a mild Ottoman colonization that was limited to the presence of functionaries or military or soldiers, garrisons, I mean. And interestingly is that Ottoman functionaries and soldiers were often not Turkish. So even the presence in there of the Turks was relatively limited, even though they were all lands that remained formally for many centuries under Ottoman domination. This is very interesting, and this actually reflects, it was actually also wanted by the Ottomans, because they realized that many of these communities would have not accepted, let's say, a more imposing presence. And were also clever because the functionaries, we have seen how the soldiers were recruited, but by the way, the janissaries they were Muslim, but they were usually Albanians. They were actually recruited from the Balkanic, from the toughest lands of the Balkans, honestly. But relatively to the functionaries, there were actually lots of Greek functionaries, because the Greeks were the only one there that historically speaking, thanks to the Byzantine Empire and a certain social organization, were some of the most cultured people around. They were sent as functionaries, as ambassadors. Romania, for instance, that was never actually brought under the direct Ottoman domination, was, however, ruled in a decentralized fashion by certain Ottoman functionaries whose name I don't remember, that, however, were traditionally Greeks, and if I'm not wrong, they were Orthodox Greeks, because that was the only way to be accepted by the Romanian population. So even looking at borders and frontier of the Ottoman Empire, it's pretty difficult, because, and it even doesn't make much sense, because the important thing there was even to leave a sort of flexibility of the frontiers. This had been actually also the Byzantine strategy since the early Roman Empire. I mean, the important was to leave a sort of gap area between the core lands of the empire and the external enemies, so that maybe even invasions could be bogged down, so that the core lands of the empire could be more intensively protected, and resources and military resources not overstretched everywhere. So just having a formal domain. And in fact, there were lots of Christians actually living in the Balkans that actively fought against other Christian powers together with the Ottomans, because they enjoyed that form of autonomy that basically the Ottoman Empire had granted them in some measure. So I hope this kind of gives you the idea of how, these black and white identities that we often attach to, the Westerners and Easterners are actually very blurred in many ways. And in case of the Ottoman Empire, that's a brilliant example of this. So Islamization, instead, that is also a very important thing, because the Ottoman Empire was, doesn't matter how multicultural and multi-ethnical, but it was a faithful Islamic one. Also was carried out in some measures. It basically especially affected the Greeks that inhabited Thrace and Macedon. So they were the areas that were more directly influenced by the Ottomans. While the Islamization in the other Greek and Slavic regions was instead much weaker. So also in here, religion is something that in the Balkans today is still relatively. I was talking with some Albanians recently, some of my colleagues, and they told me something very beautiful. First of all, we have to consider Albania had a terrible communist dictatorship up to very few, relatively few times, till the 90s practically. Um, and they were telling me, I mean, Albania was the Albania is today's Albania is partly Albania and Epirus from an Ottoman perspective. Those were lands that were under the Turks for many, and they were obviously exposed to many influences, especially to the Italian influences, then eventually to, obviously also the Austro-Hungarian Empire had a sort of influence in those lands. Not direct control, because actually Albania was created as a modern state to prevent actually Austria from having a further sea access. But besides that, what they tell me is that sometimes the Albanians are both Christian and Muslims, which is an extraordinary thing. Because sometimes I say, they tell me, well, I know that there are times in which I behave, and we are both, they are together. I mean, they've been blended, and obviously communism really played a bit on this, because kind of communism at that point prohibited religion. It shut down churches and mosques, so it actively prevented basically religion to be worshipped. However, there is much that actually dates back to the Turkish domination. I mean, the idea that in certain areas, being Christian or being Muslim actually didn't make a difference, and part of today's Albanian national identity stands as this perfect hybrid nature of Christian and Muslims being together. This, I don't know how many other count, because when I heard that, I didn't fully realize. I mean, I knew that Albania had both an Orthodox and a Muslim population, but I thought that it was a sort of more, let's say, sharp contrast between. And he said, no, this is not the case. Not in Albania, at least. It happens elsewhere in the Balkans, but not there. And that is very meaningful, because I think to me it expresses beautifully what really the Ottoman Empire was. Not this opposition between various faiths, but really something more more blended. I mean, sure, there were persecutions, there were violences based on religion and all, like in all countries back in the day. But the idea is that you cannot control such a huge empire if you don't let this autonomy, which is gonna invariably transform into syncretism. Because there is no other way. If you don't play in that, it doesn't really happen. And behind these religious differences, there is indeed also political, social differences. As I was saying before, if you wanted to make career into the Ottoman bureaucracy, why not? And if you were, I don't know, if you were an Orthodox Greek living in Constantinople and you saw that opportunity, why not converting to Islam, so that you were cultured, you could serve the bureaucracy, you could be paid well. And that's really the story of many people there, that Christianity remained mostly in those areas of the hinterland that had, in this sense, no reason to convert to Islam. They weren't forced to do so. There was a relative autonomy to that, and it was still an oppressive domination in many ways. I mean, the dominations at that time were oppressive by definition, because human rights did not exist. But there were other forms of, let's say, of relation that still implied, in part, this form of equilibrium. And yeah, I think that's it. for today, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested about my upcoming videos. And for now, I thank you very much for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye!